Well, what I'd love to talk about, the future of cities. How do you see the forces that will shape the city of the future? But if architecture is about improving the quality of life, then surely this is right at the heart of architecture. How do we effect that revolution, that transformation? Could I kind of launch straight in? By way of introduction, Ricky, when I think of cities, I think of you. You've advised mayors, you've been part of a government task force, you played a part in bringing the Olympics, planning it in London. You focused on cities in the Biennale, urban task force, but most of all, I think of your cities program and your professorship at LSE. Could you give a few words about how that might relate to the city of the future, its aims and its ambitions?
Well, if I think of what runs through the experiences you've just described, which are partly personal and partly professional, is an enduring fascination and interest of the physical world and the social world. I think that has been at the heart of many of the things that I've been involved in, the discussions you and I have had, and other such initiatives. And I would have thought that even in the 25 years or so that we've all been looking at these issues, the mere fact that one is connecting the physical with the social, and of course by social I mean cultural, political, economic, and by physical I mean everything from the design of buildings to streets and infrastructure. The future of our cities has to understand that connection, because I would say, I'm sure we'll talk about this, that's been one of the problems, that the design of the built environment in cities has not necessarily been kind or friendly when it comes to sort of social issues, and in many ways has caused some of the problems that we're having to sort of fix now. So I think that would be a leitmotif of my interest in cities, which might inform a discussion of the future.
So, if you were to project forward to the city of the future, which is going to be the embodiment of, presumably, of trends which are already apparent, if you took a utopian view of that, where would it lead you?
Well, the first thing I would say is that that the answer to that good question has to be different in different parts of the world. So I think that the utopian city in African parts of Asia is probably different, and that's not a negative from the utopian remodeling of, let's say, maybe the European city or the North American city, and we can think about that. But there are certain themes in common, for sure, despite what I've said. One is that for a city to work, both environmentally and socially, it has to be dense and compact. I think the notion of a never-ending, sprawling piece of urban infrastructure, which we've seen so much of over the last 50, 60 years, right? And it hasn't diminished, doesn't have what our common friend Saskia Sassen refers to as cityness, that ability to interact, to connect. And in that sense, even the utopian city of the future is always going to be about coming together to transact ideas, to transact goods, to transact even, yes, money in many ways. But I think the city of the future will be therefore closer and more compact. It will have different forms of efficient transport, and that's where the geography changes a lot in terms of what technology might be available, might be affordable. It will be far more responsive to environmental issues than we have been in the past. And ultimately, it will be fairer. In other words, that the spatial planning itself will try to avoid the tendencies towards segregation and difference. And that's where I think literally where you are in the world matters. Simple example, if you are on the far outlying fringes of, say, Lagos or Dakar or Sao Paulo in Brazil, you live a life of extreme exclusion, which is not as physically clear in some of the cities that we are lucky enough to live in Europe, but are dramatically in your face in terms of difference in, say, some American cities when it comes to issues of race and poverty. So there are different ingredients, but I think the long-term aspiration of a physical environment that promotes integration, social integration, and environmental justice are certainly possible. Their shape won't necessarily be the same as in the in the Pacific Rim or in the Americas.
I mean, the pursuit of the dense city, which obviously you're promoting through the LSE, through your teaching, through your lectures, writing. How does that message get across to those emerging economies where the rate of urbanization, the need to create new cities, how do you avoid the kind of flywheel effect of those cities being cast in a model which is already seen to be obsolete in the West? In other words, you've got, in other words, to what extent can cities learn from each other?
I think I would go back to this term which has gone in and out of fashion for the last at least 100 years, planning. I think planning is rather important. In fact, this year of COVID that we've just experienced, and it continues, has in many ways, and we've discussed this, put planning back on the map and being given some sort of credibility that, you need to plan in order to avoid disasters. And I think if we go back to the core of your question about how do you manage the mainly informal process of extremely rapid growth in, say, parts of Africa or Asia? And let's remember, we're talking about numbers whereby every minute and a half you and I are speaking, one more person is either born or has moved to the cities that I'm talking about. I mean, that's the rate of change at which we're actually describing. So the implications for housing, for medical infrastructure, sanitation, electricity, everything else is obviously not just a question of scale, but it's a question of speed. And therefore, a return to very simple regulations about planning are the only way, Norman, that you can control the issue of density. And much of the planning regimes in many of these cities are literally out of sync with our times. In other words, there will be quantitative regulations which say you can only build up to X. In other words, a maximum density, and often unrelated to access to transport, not to mention public transport. Those are the things that can be reversed, and if anything, one can learn, let's call it north, south, east, west as an exchange. But then, of course, you and I have studied many of the informal settlements, whether they're favelas in Brazil, whether it's a word which I don't like using, neither you, the slum settlement, the informal settlement in India, which actually have many of these qualities inbuilt into them. They're all about density and intensity of overlap of different uses. We hear about the 15-minute city in Paris at the moment. Well, Dharavi is the perfect example of that. It's not just a large area where only people of a certain class live. There's an economy alive there. There's transactions happening. So to pull out some of these elements of what works in the informal dense city and how you regulate for that is where I think we need to go. And it does require planning. And that leads to governance, which we'll come to.
It also is inseparable from education. I mean, I think that when we use the word planning, you and I both know without spelling it out what we mean. But the reality in terms of the education system is, I think, rather different. So schools of architecture, for example, focus on buildings. Rarely do they talk about the nature of a public space, the creation of a street. It's very much the individual building in isolation. And planning is taught almost as kind of spreadsheets. So there isn't a tradition of urbanism in the education system, but you're closer to it. I mean, how do you see that?
Well, I think the issue of education of all the professions involved in making the built environment, whether it's transport planners, architects, even landscape architects, etc., still inhabiting silos is absolutely the case. And there are few attempts at, let's call it, more transversal education, which is what you're talking about. Call it interdisciplinary, what else? That's one issue, and I'll come back to that with the LSE example, perhaps. But the other one is that, as you said, that planning itself is taught as practically a spreadsheet approach, right? A matrix. It completely is two-dimensional. And I think one of the key things that we've all tried to reintroduce into the discussion about cities, you can't talk about density without talking about the three-dimensional experience. And it's not just the height of building, it's the section of the street, where the windows are, where the trees are, how does it feel to cross the street and perhaps live and work and do leisure within a sort of relatively constrained environment. So that I think is an important question. Going back to my own experience at the London School of Economics, it's now 20 years, in fact, that we set up, you were part of the first advisory board, this effectively quite innovative program because of its transversality, right? And in many ways, Norman, it was probably easier to do that within an educational environment which shapes decision makers, policy makers, investors, rather than people who shape cities, or in terms, i.e., architects or planners themselves. There is no doubt, and I am quite critical of the professional bodies themselves, which are highly protective. You know, at worst, you could call them sort of traditional, old-style unions that don't want to innovate. And at another level, they're only interested in, in fees that are paid in on an annual basis and without taking the discourse forward. So the advantage of being at the London School of Economics at that time was that there were, let's say, there was no need to have the degree ratified by, let us say, the Royal Institute of British Architects or the Royal Town Planning Institute, which gives therefore quite a lot of elbow room and to create the environment done. The one thing I'm most proud of there is that not only are we able and now educated, many generations of students in their 20s and 30s, but we're now doing an executive program where mayors, national government ministers, people who are investing in serious real estate projects in Manila or Brazil, but also architects and the classic urbanists are doing this program while they work. In other words, not as they are in these positions of some authority. We had the deputy mayor of Vienna, who was in charge of 35,000 homes, actually doing our program just a couple of years ago, and many others of that sort. And I think, therefore, connecting with people who take decisions on a daily basis today is highly significant to get this message over. Because, Norman, the urgency is essential. When we go back to the point I made about speed, if you let another 3 years pass, in Africa, you will have cities growing by maybe 1.5 million people, right? And if we lose this window of opportunity of actually designing them, and I mean design, of course, in a bigger sense, not just the street pattern, but much more, we really do run the risk of imprisoning people in an environment which is deeply unsustainable.
So how do we effect that revolution, that transformation? Because it's really in attitude of mind, in thinking. It's a plea for a holistic approach, because if you're also seeking to move to a circular economy where, for example, a department which is concerned with waste and a department which is concerned with energy should be working together to convert waste to energy. And that's a very small scale example. I mean, a city, as we know, is far more complex. I mean, how do you see working towards that goal?
So, Rupert, I mean, you're coming to the point that I just alluded to earlier, which is governance. And unless you have, as for example, Scandinavian cities have shown most recently, Copenhagen in particular would be a wonderful example. Sweden's city government equally, whereby the different departments, as you say, the sanitation and waste department, work with the planning department, who work with the electrical company, et cetera, in a transversal way to, in a way, coordinate what you call small decisions, but fundamental decisions, which shape not just the environment and the physical plan, but our behaviors, our lifestyle choices. I mean, the two need to be connected. If I go back to my social and the physical, I would add behavioral science is actually part of that. How do you make someone change their mind? But the second point I didn't want to lose from your question is that integrating different levels of governance, not just transversely in terms of the different departments, the different disciplines, let's call it, but between national government, state government, city government. I think the more I study these things, the more I realize it's important. Why? Because if you don't have a national government policy which promotes clean air, say, or that believes in equity, it's going to be very difficult for the city on its own, however well integrated the different departments are, to enact change. So, I've been studying Barcelona recently. They, in many ways, is well, from your work with Pasquale Maragall there many years ago, how innovative it's been able to be in terms of promoting the dense city, the integrated city, but it still is a city which suffers from very large number of commuting patterns. Why? Because the cars or residents that live in Catalonia, the wider area, commute in and out, but the mayor, however good or bad he or she is, in this case it's Ada Colau, can't actually have no jurisdiction about who actually drives in or drives out. Another famous case is the case of New York City versus London. The mayor of New York, whether it was Michael Bloomberg or now Bill de Blasio, and soon to be another one, has been completely unable to decide whether they might have congestion charge. Why? Because it is the governor of New York, Cuomo, therefore the state of the whole of New York, much larger entity, and New York City is not that important when it comes to the state of New York, however much New Yorkers think they're the center of the world. The budget is actually determined by the state. And as a result, a number of local decisions on transport, etc., cannot and have not been made. That is quite different from the case of London, where the mayor of London, not necessarily the perfect model, I have to stress, but the mayor of London is the chairman of Transport for London. And we have seen over the last 20 years, which is since a direct elected mayor was instituted here in this city, in London, has been able to make rather substantive investments in the public transport system. So it's not just a question of, let's call it horizontal integration, but also vertical integration.
To what extent do you think that some of the trends that we're sensing in mobility, the prospect of driverless vehicles, platooning, densely consuming far less road space, do you think that has the power to transform suburbia, for example? Do you see that being disruptive and upsetting some of the conventional wisdom on density, for example?
I think it's possible, but again, regulation and who decides is part of that. It won't just happen just in response to the market, because simply in the thinner suburban areas, there isn't the critical mass to support some of these innovative technologies at first, and I think that may change. We did see in London, which is a highly distributed city. It's actually not that dense, as you and I know, except for some areas, that the arrival of Uber did actually make suburbia more livable, and it's slowly becoming denser, and that's also because of government regulation and investment in the Crossrail line and other forms of sort of localized transport. So the answer to your question is that I think you can't do it just with transport infrastructure or technology itself. You need to have a sort of vision of maybe a multi-centered city, as our the great planner Peter Hall used to talk about when he was around, and I know we're often in conversations with him about these issues. But you can even talk about multi-centered regions, with hubs of centrality around them where this technology would actually make the difference. But the physical structure needs to allow that to happen. If you have one home every 300 meters and a very large garden, I don't think any of these systems are going to work.
Absolutely. Ricky, I mean, if this is a platform to get a message out for the future, what do you think the important messages are?
Well, one is that we can't really start thinking about the design of the cities of the future without completely connecting that to issues of social equity and environmental justice. They've got to be part of the same way of thinking, and unfortunately, even the tendency today amongst, say, environmental groups is not to take planning, as you and I use it, as a code, as a central issue. That everything depends on your eating habits and other things. All true. But we also know, as my colleague Nick Stern, the climate economist, says, that it's in cities that you can either make the problem worse or solve the problem, simply because so many people in the world live now and will continue to increasingly live in cities over the next 30, 40 years. So even reducing our environmental footprint by 10 or 20%, obviously the aspiration is more than that, can make a critical impact on the planetary equation. The second issue, if the first is the environmental connection to the physical infrastructure, the second one, and this has been absolutely highlighted by COVID in the last year or so, is that cities themselves can be mechanisms of deep inequality. They're just there. And all it took is this pandemic for us to suddenly wake up in whatever city we happen to live in and realize that, sort of underneath the surface, it's not obvious. There are people who live even in some of the most advanced economies, let's call it below the breadline. And can we design environments that actually offer them opportunities, access to parks, to the physical infrastructures of schools, social services, so that they have a more equitable life? I think that needs to come back and be at the top of the agenda. Who does that best? A mayor. So that's my second message. Make sure that every city has a directly elected, very important, not appointed by the prime minister or the state minister, a directly elected mayor who he or she can put down a provocative agenda. If it works, they get reelected. If not, they get kicked out. But give them the powers and to a degree also the money to impact and affect that change.
Those are great messages. Thank you so much, Ricky. Thank
Okay, that's all good.
you.